Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and asked yourself, what will happen when I am no more? That feeling, half curiosity, half fear, is a universal human experience, transcending all cultural and historical boundaries. Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers of all time, the mind behind War and Peace and Anna Karenina, spent the final years of his life contemplating this very question. And the answer he found might surprise you. The body will decay and turn to dust. That much we know for certain. But what will happen to the thing we call the soul? We cannot give an answer because the question, what will happen, is related to time. However, the soul does not belong to time or exist within time. Today, we embark on a journey to explore the greatest question of humanity, not only through Tolstoy's perspective, but also by comparing it with other philosophical and religious traditions across the world. Throughout history, countless answers have been proposed: union with God, reincarnation into another life, or simply dissolving into nothingness. But is there an answer that truly satisfies? Before we examine these different viewpoints, let me pose another question. Could it be that our fear of death exists only because we have misunderstood our true nature? Tolstoy offers a bold idea. The fear of death exists only when we identify ourselves with the body. But if the body is merely a tool, then what is our true essence? In this video, we will explore not only Tolstoy's perspective, but also compare it with Socrates, Plato, Lao Tzu, Buddhist teachings, Christianity, and even modern philosophy. Perhaps, within their answers, you might find a sense of peace in the face of this ultimate question. To understand Tolstoy's perspective on death, we must first grasp how he viewed human nature. According to Tolstoy, each of us possesses two parallel selves. The first is the physical self, which he called the animal self. This is our material aspect, our body, senses, and primal emotions. This self follows the laws of the physical world. It is born, grows, ages, and eventually dies. The second is the spiritual self, or what Tolstoy referred to as the enlightened self. He believed this was the sacred part within each person: the soul, moral consciousness, and conscience. Unlike the physical self, this part does not obey the rules of matter or time. When observing life, one can notice these two distinct selves within. One is blind, while the other is enlightened. The blind self governs the body, whereas the enlightened self governs the mind. To illustrate this idea, Tolstoy used a profound metaphor: a clock. He wrote, "A clock's hand can move either by a finger's force or by its internal mechanism. The best way is to let the clock move by its own mechanism rather than by our hand. Similarly, man is best guided by his consciousness rather than his animal nature." What makes Tolstoy's view unique is that he did not see the soul as something bound by time, as we often do. He wrote, "The soul does not belong to time. The soul has no has been or will be. It simply is. Without it, nothing could exist." This is a deeply profound idea. Tolstoy is suggesting that our true essence, the soul, is not confined within time. It does not have a past or a future the way the body does. It exists beyond these limitations. If you reflect on this, you might notice that there is a part of you that seems to always observe your life unfolding. When you recall your childhood or imagine the future, there is a self that seems unchanged, silently witnessing everything. Tolstoy believed that this unchanging self is our true essence. And if it does not belong to time, how can it end when the time of our body runs out? We can observe how the body changes, from infancy to adulthood to old age. But there is something within us that does not change, does not age, does not weaken. Even when the body grows frail, this part remains the same. Thus, Tolstoy concluded that our true existence cannot end with the death of the body, and this belief formed the foundation of his view on what happens after death. But Tolstoy was not the first to think this way. Centuries before him, the ancient Greek philosophers had already proposed similar ideas. More than 2,400 years ago, in ancient Athens, a philosopher faced death with astonishing serenity. His name was Socrates, condemned to death for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. Socrates refused the opportunity to escape and instead willingly drank the fatal hemlock. What shocked his disciples was not just his acceptance of death, but the way he welcomed it, with joy. In his final moments, while his followers mourned, it was Socrates who comforted them and explained the nature of death. Plato, his student, recorded his words in Phaedo: "A man who has spent his life striving to master his passions while being hindered by his body cannot help but rejoice when he is finally freed from it. And death is that liberation." Socrates' perspective on death bears striking similarities to Tolstoy's. Both saw the body as a kind of prison or tool that the soul must use during life, and death as a release from its constraints. Socrates stated, "The process of self-perfection involves striving to separate the soul from the body as much as possible, teaching it to collect and focus on itself, independently of the body, and death provides that release." 2,000 years later, Tolstoy echoed the same idea. When we are born, our soul is placed into the coffin of the body. This coffin, our body, gradually deteriorates, and our soul is increasingly set free. However, there is a subtle difference between them. Socrates, according to Plato, believed in reincarnation, that the soul continues to exist in another form after leaving the body. He also believed in a realm of forms or ideas where the soul could attain perfect knowledge. Tolstoy, on the other hand, was more cautious about making precise claims about what happens after death. He suggested two possibilities. When we die, only one of two things can happen to us. Either what we consider to be ourselves will transition into another being, or we will cease to exist as separate entities and unite with God. Plato, Socrates' student, expanded on his master's ideas by developing the theory of two worlds: the phenomenal world, the material world, which we perceive through our senses, and the ideal world, the world of pure ideas, which we can only grasp through intellectual reasoning. For Plato, the soul belongs to the world of ideas and is merely temporarily imprisoned in the body. He wrote about death. "No one knows what death truly is, yet people fear it as if it were the worst of evils, when in reality, it may be the greatest blessing." The clearest parallel between Tolstoy and the ancient Greek philosophers lies in their view of preparing for death. Both Socrates and Tolstoy believed that the philosophical life is a lifelong training for death, not to avoid it, but to embrace it properly. Socrates spent his life practicing death, by which he meant focusing on the soul rather than the body. Similarly, Tolstoy wrote, "The more spiritual our life becomes, the more we believe in immortality. As our nature moves away from the coarseness of the animal, even our doubts gradually disappear." Both Socrates, Plato, and Tolstoy saw death not as an end, but as a transition, a next step in the soul's journey. But this perspective is not unique to Western philosophy. In the East, ancient traditions have also developed profound insights into the nature of death. While the West was shaping its views on death, civilizations in the East were exploring the same questions, but through their own unique paths. Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese sage from the 6th century BCE and the founder of Taoism, left behind profound insights on life, death, and the nature of the universe in the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu wrote, "All things in the world grow, flourish, and return to their root." Returning to the root is natural rest. That which is in harmony with nature is eternal. Therefore, the dissolution of the body holds no danger. This perspective bears a striking resemblance to Tolstoy. Both saw death as a natural process, a return to the source. Tolstoy wrote, "A man leaves his home, works, rests, eats, entertains himself, works again, and when he is weary, he returns home." Human life is the same. We come from God, And after all the ups and downs, we return home, to where we came from. Both use the imagery of returning to the source, a powerful concept in Taoism. Lao Tzu saw death as simply a part of the natural cycle, like a river ultimately merging into the ocean. Meanwhile, Buddhism builds its understanding of death on the concept of anatta, non-self, the idea that there is no fixed, unchanging self. Instead, what we call I is merely a collection of ever-changing elements. At first glance, this seems to contradict Tolstoy, who believed in an eternal soul. But on a deeper level, there is an unexpected similarity. When Tolstoy speaks of merging with God, he describes a state that transcends personal identity, closely resembling the Buddhist concept of nirvana. Tolstoy wrote, "Some say, true immortality can only exist if my personal self remains intact. But my personal self is the very thing I despise most in this world, and I have spent my entire life trying to be free from it." Buddhism teaches about samsara, the cycle of birth and death that continues until one attains enlightenment. This concept is not explicitly found in Tolstoy's writings, but he did write, "You came into this world without knowing how, yet you know that you arrived. Then you walk the path of life, and suddenly, midway, you are afraid. You stop and refuse to go further because you cannot see what lies there." But you had not seen this world before you entered it either, and yet nothing bad happened to you. In Hindu philosophy, there is the concept of Atman, the eternal self within each person, and Brahman, the ultimate reality of the universe. The ultimate goal is to realize that Atman and Brahman are one. One Hindu teaching that Tolstoy referenced states, "The soul does not dwell in the body as in its home, but as a wanderer in a strange shelter." The deepest common thread between Tolstoy and Eastern philosophy is their view of death as transformation rather than termination. Tolstoy compared death to the metamorphosis of a butterfly. This process is like the transformation of a butterfly from a caterpillar. We are like caterpillars. First, we are born, then we fall into the sleep of the cocoon. But we recognize ourselves as butterflies in our future life. Meanwhile, Taoist philosophy sees this transformation as a natural part of the Tao, the way of the universe. Despite differences in detail and language, both Tolstoy and Eastern traditions share a fundamental intuition. Death is not an end, but a shift in the state of existence. They also emphasize transcending attachment to the personal ego. But Tolstoy was also raised in a Christian environment. So how did his views relate to traditional Christian teachings on death and immortality? Lev Tolstoy was born into a Russian aristocratic family of the Orthodox Christian faith. However, his relationship with the Orthodox Church and traditional Christianity was complex and filled with contradictions. In his later years, Tolstoy developed his own form of Christianity, one that focused on Jesus' moral teachings rather than the formal doctrines of the Church. In 1901, the Russian Orthodox Church officially excommunicated him. Despite this, Tolstoy always considered himself a Christian, and his views on death still contained many elements of Christian belief. In Christian tradition, death is not the end, but a transition to eternal life. The soul is seen as immortal, and after death, comes before God to await the resurrection of the body on the last judgment day. Tolstoy also believed in the immortality of the soul, but he placed less emphasis on the concept of judgment, heaven, or hell in a literal sense. He wrote, "Christ, as he was dying, cried out, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.'" If he spoke these words not just with his lips but with his heart, what more does a man need? If my soul returns to the one from whom it came, then nothing can happen to my soul except good. A key difference between Tolstoy and traditional Christian teachings lies in his view of uniting with God after death. While Orthodox Christianity emphasizes the retention of personal identity and reunion with God, Tolstoy questioned the value of maintaining the self after death. He wrote, "Only when you grow weary of your separation from the world, when you realize the full horror of this isolation, does death become a joy. One longs to say, 'Enough of this cage. Give me another way of being in the world, one that better suits my soul.'" In traditional Christianity, salvation requires faith in Jesus Christ and His grace. Tolstoy, on the other hand, emphasized living according to Jesus' moral teachings and loving others. For him, salvation was not something that happened after death, but rather a spiritual state that could be achieved in this life. Tolstoy reinterpreted many Christian doctrines in a more spiritual than supernatural way. For example, he did not see resurrection as a physical event, but as a spiritual awakening, an awareness of one's true nature. In this regard, his views aligned more closely with certain branches of liberal Christianity and modern theology than with traditional churches. He wrote, "A wise man, when affirming the immortality of the soul, was asked, 'But what will become of the world?' He replied, 'For my soul to live, no world is necessary at all.'" Within the religious landscape of 19th century Russia, Tolstoy's views were considered radical and even heretical. He rejected the Trinity, miracles, and many Orthodox doctrines. Yet he held a deep faith in God and the importance of love. Tolstoy wrote about his belief, "Only one thing matters to me, to know what God wants me to do." And this is made clear not only in all religions, but also in my own conscience. Despite significant differences, Tolstoy and Christianity shared a fundamental belief that humans possess a spiritual essence beyond the material world, and that death is not an absolute end. The key distinction lies in this. While traditional Christianity focuses on eternal life as a future reward, Tolstoy emphasized overcoming the fear of death by living a moral life in the present. Now, let us explore the deeper causes of the fear of death and how Tolstoy proposed to overcome it. Death, the deepest and most universal fear of humankind. But Tolstoy posed a provocative question. Could this fear be nothing more than a fundamental misunderstanding of our true nature? According to Tolstoy, the fear of death arises from our mistaken identification with the body, a fundamental error in self-perception. He wrote, "We fear death only because we mistakenly believe that our body, the tool we have become accustomed to using for labor, is our true self. But if we become accustomed to seeing our true self as the one directing that tool, our spirit, then would there be any fear left?" He used a simple yet powerful analogy to illustrate this point. A person who sees the body as a tool given to them for work will only feel a sense of awkwardness at the moment of death, just as a laborer would feel when their familiar tool is taken away before a new one is given. One of Tolstoy's most profound analyses of the fear of death concerns our experience of time. He pointed out that we undergo countless bodily changes without fearing them, moving from childhood to adulthood, from adulthood to old age. We have undergone constant bodily transformations. Once, we were nothing but bare flesh, then an infant feeding at the breast. Then we grew hair and teeth, then lost some teeth and replaced them with others. Then we grew beards. Then we went bald and our hair turned gray. But we never feared these changes. So why do we fear this final transformation? Tolstoy argued that the only reason we fear this last change is that no one can return to tell us what happens after it. But again, he pointed out the irrationality of this fear. If a person departs from us on a journey and does not write back, who can say what happened to them when they arrived? We can only say that we have received no news from them. The same is true for those who have passed away. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, whom Tolstoy read and quoted, also offered deep insights into the fear of death. Schopenhauer wrote, It is a universal belief that death can end life, but it cannot end existence. Another source of fear, according to Tolstoy, is our attachment to the personal ego, what he called isolation or separation. He described this state in a vividly poetic passage. "Beneath my feet is the solid ground, frozen by the cold of winter. Around me, towering trees. Above me, a gloomy sky. I feel my body. Thoughts rush through my mind. But I feel in every fiber of my being that all of this is merely incidental, that it is all the product of my five senses, of my imagination, a world created by myself, because that is the form in which my separation from the world exists." Tolstoy suggested that death might be a liberation from this sense of isolation and separation, an opportunity to experience the world in an entirely different way, beyond the limitations of the five senses and the personal ego. Schopenhauer, though coming from a different philosophical tradition, reached a similar conclusion. Death is the release from the superficial individuality of the ego. This perhaps is why there is such serenity and peace in the face of the deceased. Another aspect of Tolstoy's perspective on the fear of death relates to the nature of time. He argued that we attempt to understand death within the framework of time, whereas the soul does not belong to time. We are asked, what will happen after death? There is only one answer to this question. The body will decay and turn to dust. That we know for certain. But what will happen to what we call the soul? We cannot answer, because the question, what will happen, belongs to the realm of time. But the soul does not belong to time. Thus, according to Tolstoy, the fear of death arises from three fundamental misunderstandings: identifying ourselves with the body, clinging to the personal ego, and attempting to comprehend the soul within the limits of time. When we overcome these misunderstandings, death ceases to be something to fear. But this leads to yet another question. What actually happens after death? After analyzing the origins of the fear of death, Tolstoy proposed a simple yet profound conclusion about what might happen when we die. According to him, there are only two possibilities. When we die, only one of two things can happen to us. Either what we consider to be ourselves will transition into another being, or we will cease to exist as separate entities and merge with God. In either case, there is nothing to fear. Let us explore the first possibility, transitioning into another entity. Tolstoy used the metaphor of a butterfly's metamorphosis to illustrate this idea. This process is like the transformation of a butterfly from a caterpillar. We are like caterpillars. First we are born, then we fall into the sleep of the cocoon. But we recognize ourselves as butterflies in our future life. Another metaphor Tolstoy used was that of a vessel and the liquid inside. Our body confines within its boundaries the divine principle that we call the soul. And these boundaries, like a vessel shaping the liquid or gas within it, give this divine principle its external form. When the vessel breaks, what was contained within no longer retains its previous shape and escapes. And perhaps the most powerful metaphor is that of scaffolding and the building. That building is the spiritual life, while the scaffolding is the body. And the one who has completed the construction of their spiritual life will rejoice at the moment of death, for the scaffolding of physical life is being removed. The second possibility Tolstoy proposed is merging with God, no longer existing as a separate entity, but becoming part of a greater whole. Tolstoy wrote about the longing to escape the isolation of the ego. Only when you grow weary of your separation from the world, when you realize the full horror of this isolation, and when the greatest joy is not merely union with all things, but at least liberation from the prison of separation in this life, only then does death become a joy. When viewed through the lens of modern philosophy, particularly existentialism, we find both intriguing similarities and differences. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus also explored the concept of death, but from a different approach. Existentialism emphasizes facing the finiteness of life as a motivation to live fully. Camus wrote that confronting death creates the absurd in life, but that very absurdity compels us to create our own meaning. While Tolstoy sought comfort in the idea of an immortal soul, existentialists often accepted the possibility of nothingness and focused on how we live in the present. Modern research on near-death experiences, NDEs, provides an interesting perspective on this discussion. Many who have faced near-death moments report a sense of merging with light, an out-of-body experience, and a profound peace. This echoes Tolstoy's words, "Something is revealed to man at the moment of death." Is this all there is? This is the expression we almost always see on the face of the dying. The modern philosopher Giuseppe Mazzini, a contemporary of Tolstoy, reached a similar conclusion from a different perspective. "I do not believe in any existing religion, but throughout my life, I have contemplated as deeply as I could on the laws of our existence. I have arrived at an unshakable belief that there is no death, that life can only be eternal." A striking parallel between Tolstoy and modern thought is the view of death as a shift in the state of consciousness. Many scientists and philosophers today consider consciousness a complex phenomenon that may not be entirely dependent on the physical brain. The contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel questioned whether we can truly understand the experience of death, just as a bat cannot comprehend what it is like to be human, and vice versa. Physicist and philosopher David Bohm proposed a model of the universe in which reality consists of multiple layers and dimensions, similar to Tolstoy's idea that death may simply be a transition from one way of perceiving the world to another. "I know that I only need to die, and all of this will not disappear, but will change form, like a scene change in a theater, where bushes and stones are transformed into palaces and towers." Whether from religious faith or modern philosophical thought, both Tolstoy and many contemporary thinkers arrive at the same conclusion. Death is not an end, but a transformation. How do we overcome the fear of death? Tolstoy did not merely analyze the origins of this fear. He also proposed a practical method for transforming our perception of death. In his final years, Tolstoy found peace when facing death. He no longer saw it as something terrifying, but rather as a natural and even necessary part of the spiritual journey. How did he reach this state? A person's life can be imagined as follows: a journey along a hallway or a cylinder, at first free and easy, but then as one expands, it gradually becomes narrower and more difficult. Feeling all the tension, pressure, and obstacles in their journey, how could they not long for the open space ahead? Tolstoy proposed several specific ways to change how we view death. First, see death as a natural change in the continuous flow of life, no different from other transformations we have already experienced. Death is like birth. When a child is born, they enter a new world, beginning a life completely different from the one they had in the womb. If the child could describe their experience of leaving their previous existence, it would be similar to what someone experiences when leaving this life. Second, Tolstoy suggested that we see death as an awakening from a dream. We can view life as a dream, and death as an awakening. Third, recognize our true self, not as the aging, weakening physical body, but as the ever-growing and evolving spiritual being. Humans observe trees and animals being born, growing strong, reproducing, then weakening, declining, aging, and dying. But beyond what they can observe, they also perceive something within themselves that does not decline or age, something that grows stronger and more beautiful the longer they live. Everyone is aware of their soul, which cannot share the fate of the body. Fourth, focus on living a meaningful life, striving for spiritual growth and love. One who sees the meaning of life in the pursuit of spiritual perfection cannot believe in death, in the interruption of that pursuit. What is on the path to perfection cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed. Fifth, Tolstoy encouraged trust in the fundamental goodness of the universe and God, believing that whatever happens will bring blessings. If we believe that everything that has happened to us in life has been for our benefit, we cannot help but believe that what happens to us in death will also be for our benefit. Finally, Tolstoy advised overcoming attachment to the personal ego and material desires. Death is the liberation from the superficiality of the ego. This, perhaps, is why there is serenity and peace on the face of the deceased. But to die willingly, voluntarily, and joyfully is the privilege of one who has renounced themselves, of one who has given up a life of personal identity. In his famous novella, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Tolstoy describes a man facing death with initial terror, but who ultimately finds peace when he lets go of his fear and accepts his fate. This serves as a literary illustration of the exact transformation Tolstoy experienced in his own life. Tolstoy's personal journey, from a young aristocrat, wealthy but plagued by spiritual crises, to an elderly man who embraced death with serenity, perfectly reflects the teachings he shared. The deeper your awareness of life, the less you believe in its destruction through death. Perhaps the greatest wisdom Tolstoy offers is this: the way we live determines the way we die. If we live with an awareness of our spiritual nature, if we cultivate love and let go of the ego, then death ceases to be a threat and becomes a natural transition, even a liberation. Our journey through Tolstoy's ideas and the philosophical and religious traditions surrounding death has not led us to a definitive conclusion, but rather to a new perspective, one that helps us live more deeply. Tolstoy, along with other great thinkers from Socrates to Lao Tzu, shared one fundamental view. Death is not a tragic end, but an essential part of a greater journey. They saw in death not an annihilation, but a transition. Through powerful metaphors, the butterfly emerging from its cocoon, the shattered vessel releasing the liquid inside, the scaffolding removed when the building is complete, Tolstoy offered us vivid images to help us understand that death is not destruction, but liberation. From Greek philosophy, we learn that death can be a teacher, showing us how to live. From Taoism and Buddhism, we absorb the idea of death as a natural cycle, a return to the source. From Christianity, we recognize the hope of continued existence. And from modern philosophy, we explore new perspectives on consciousness and reality. But perhaps the most important lesson from Tolstoy is not about what happens after death, but how we live before it. The one who misunderstands life will also misunderstand death. Tolstoy suggested that the fear of death reflects a misguided way of living, a life too attached to the body, too identified with the personal ego, and too disconnected from our spiritual nature. Instead, he encouraged us to strive for spiritual growth, to transcend the boundaries of the self through love, and to recognize that the deepest part of us, the soul, does not belong to time or space. The awareness of being confined within the personal body always longs to expand its limits. This is the first half of human life. In this half, a person expresses ever greater love for things and people, transcending their own boundaries, extending their consciousness to other living beings. In the modern world, where death is often hidden, denied, or medicalized, Tolstoy's ideas offer an alternative approach, one of direct confrontation, acceptance, and even the embrace of death as an integral part of a meaningful life. Whether or not you believe in an immortal soul, whether or not you follow a religion, Tolstoy's reflections can help us live more fully, love more deeply, and face the reality of death with greater peace. If we believe that everything that has happened to us in life was for our benefit, we cannot help but believe that whatever happens to us in death will also be for our benefit. Tolstoy could not give us a definitive answer about what happens after death. No one can. But he has given us the tools to face the fear of death, to live more fully, and to view our journey on this earth with gratitude and deeper understanding. Thank you for joining me on this philosophical exploration. I hope you have found something worth contemplating, and perhaps these ideas will help you live more completely rather than in fear. Because the one who knows others is wise. The one who knows themselves is enlightened. The one who conquers others is strong. The one who conquers themselves is powerful. But the one who, at death, knows they are not destroyed, that one is eternal.